Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here for the Public Safety Committee. Just a couple quick things before I ask Reverend McDowell to bless this meeting. Public Safety Committee is an offshoot of council, and when we have an issue that gets referred to this committee, we meet and we discuss it and we go back. Normally, a lot of our issues are handled by the whole council, but today we have a review of the code enforcement policies by Mr. David Hatcher. And thank the chief and Madam City Manager and Madam Clerk. Reverend McDowell, will you mind saying a word of prayer before we start?
Thank you, Mr. Rick. Let us pray. Lord, for this day and the busyness of this day and the gratefulness that we've already experienced, we thank each person for being here today as we discuss safety issues within our city. Sensitize us to the needs of our citizens, and yet undergird us with the kind of conversation that might continue to befit the city of ours. Lord, we ask it in your name. Amen.
Amen. Mr. Hatcher, you mind coming forward, please? Thank you for being here.
Is there? Well, good afternoon, members of council, Ms. Wilson, excuse me, I'm having a hard time today, and Chief. For those of you who don't know my name who are watching, I'm David Hatcher, housing official for the City of Columbia in charge of the Code Enforcement Division. Thank you for taking the time today to hear my presentation. The Code Enforcement Division was merged into the Columbia Police Department in July 2014 under the direction of Columbia Police Chief Skip Holbrook. Since then, there have been several major ordinance changes since the merger to include the Residential Rental Ordinance, the Nuisance Ordinance, and the Vacant Building Ordinance. We've also had several major accomplishments in addition to these ordinances, to include, obviously, the implementation of those ordinances, the implementation of a commercial code enforcement program. We implemented an InterGov software to track our code cases and do our reporting. We implemented portable cameras for illegal dumping activity. We implemented our mobile code enforcement program. And since then, we've received over $500,000 in grants for demolition of substandard structures. The last 18 months have been a major challenge for us and for the city as a whole with the COVID-19 pandemic. The level of expected service that we provide to our citizens has remained constant, while the level of staffing availability of municipal court to prosecute cases, and in-person interactions have drastically reduced. Today, the COVID threat is still active and very prominent in our day-to-day activities. However, we're in a much better position than we were to enforce ordinances 12 months ago. While there are several challenges that we face with enforcing codes, two major challenges are repeat offenders, especially with rental properties, and our ability to abate some violations. More specifically, with the rental ordinance, the current point system for rental permits gives too many opportunities for landlords and tenants to create problems before we take any serious actions. We also currently give the fees of the first 5 points that are assessed. With 15-point allowance, we are allowing multiple violations to continue to occur at rental properties. These points reset after 12 months. Another challenge is motor vehicles that are inoperable, unlicensed, or in major disrepair, also referred to as abandoned derelict vehicles, as they are harbors for rodents and can be traps for children. We also have other challenges with staffing, training, accountability, some limitations on serving summonses that we are currently addressing internally. Today, I'm suggesting two major ordinance changes, specifically in the rental ordinance and the nuisance ordinance. There are several other minor revisions that I'm going to propose in the future that will help clean up the ordinance, some of the wording a little bit in the nuisance ordinance, and give us more teeth with enforcement on tarps, overgrown shrubs, and unmaintained landscaping. With that, I'll jump into the major ordinance changes I'm suggesting. The rental ordinance, as y'all, I think most of y'all were here when it was passed, and it's 5 years old. We currently have about 27,000 registered rental units in the city. In general, it has been a very effective tool in improving the quality of life for renters and reducing issues at properties subject to the ordinance. Although most landlords are compliant, we have some who repeatedly refuse to comply and or who are difficult to locate. Like with any ordinance, you'll have those who automatically comply with requirements, some that we have to encourage to comply, then others who will not comply or even be made to comply. We are testing a new policy to issue summonses via a process servicing company. The intent is to use this service for property owners who live out of state that are unresponsive to our notices when abatement isn't really a viable option. We are also assessing points and issuing summonses to tenants and landlords as often as necessary. However, that doesn't seem to be enough to prevent repeat offenses. Over the last 3 years, we have averaged about 1,100 points on about 500 rental units. That is about 2.2 points per unit when you calculate the average. Of those units with points, we are finding about 22% of them are responsible for 63% of the points. To me, this illustrates that for the most part, the majority of the points we assess are to repeat offenders.
David, when you, in the repeat offenders, is that new tenants involved in that, or is it the same tenants, the same landlords?
It could be. I haven't looked individually to see what exactly. I'm just looking at the overall numbers. But part of the issue with when the points reset after 12 months, I mean, it could be new tenants. The problem is after 12 months, they get a fresh start, so we never really can hold the landlord accountable. So with that, I'm suggesting we modify the point system. Currently, we assess 1 point for first violation, 2 points for second violation, and 5 points for the third and each violation thereafter. There is a 10-point assessment for serious life safety violations. My suggestion is to amend the ordinance to assess 1 point for first offense, 5 points for second offense, and 5 points for each offense thereafter. This gives some leniency for the first violation while discouraging any repeat violations. The 10-point assessment for serious life safety violations would remain the same. Additionally, I'm suggesting that we remove the exemption from the penalties that currently exempts the first $500 or $100 per point for the first 5 points. This is, again, to discourage repeat offenses. Over the last few years, we have collected about $5,900 on average each year for points violations. If we remove the exemption, we could see as much as $111,000 in fees collected annually, or less if we can discourage repeat offenders, which would be the goal. The next ordinance. In general, the issue of abandoned derelict vehicles located on private property occurs throughout the city. However, there are certain areas where it is more prevalent. Currently, the city cannot tag inoperable or unlicensed vehicles for towing under SC Code 56-5-5840, like we do with vehicles that are in the right-of-way. When the vehicle is located on private property, when the property owner does not object to the vehicle being on their property. That's in accordance with the Attorney General opinion put out in 2009, which is included in your packet. However, in SC Code 56-5-5820, it provides that abandoned and derelict vehicles constitute a hazard to the health and welfare of the people of the state, and that such vehicles can harbor noxious diseases, furnish shelter and breeding places for vermin, and present physical dangers to safety and well-being of children and other citizens. It is therefore in the public interest that the present accumulation of abandoned and derelict vehicles be eliminated and that the future abandonment of such vehicles be prevented. That's in state statute. Our nuisance ordinance already declares that abandoned derelict vehicles are a public nuisance. The Code Enforcement Division gets a lot of complaints about abandoned derelict vehicles across the city. They make up about 13% of our caseload. Of the 674 cases we have open now, 27% of them have been open almost a year now. Currently, to encourage abatement, we're issuing notices and summonses when we can clearly identify a violation. However, I think we need to add the ability to tow these vehicles when there is failure to abate by owner. Excuse me.
And those are vehicles that are currently not operable and not paying taxes, correct?
Correct. And of course, that would be a last resort, as is when we demolish properties, it's a last resort, and it would only be used in extreme circumstances. So to address this specifically, yes, sir.
And I know there may be a distinction, but when I look at cars that are abandoned, what about cars that are, say, on both sides of the street, has a business, and that precludes person turning off a main thoroughfare onto this street, passage on that particular street? Is that something you do, something that we could look at, or is this something that chief?
It'd probably be
And
a combination.
I could give you some specifics,
Yes, sir.
but you've got a business, and on either side of this business, there are numerous cars from one end of a main thoroughfare all the way down. How do we deal with that? Is that a code enforcement, or is that CPD chief, or?
It's probably a combination. I don't know if the chief wants to say something. It's probably a combination of things like parking services and police with if it's blocking traffic visibility, or if it's, again, if it's abandoned cars or stuff, the code enforcement division might get involved. If it's a garage, like a towing facility or something
That's
like
correct.
that, then there may be some zoning violations there, because they may have some limitations to how many cars they can have stored. And I believe they have to store them on the property. They can't store them in the street. So there are a lot of things already in place for that. It's probably just a collaboration with multiple departments to
I know it's probably
address it.
zoning, code enforcement, CPD,
and parking services.
that's correct. But you've got several places on this main thoroughfare that has those kinds of violations. And I was wondering whether or not, if collaborating with you and with chief and with zoning, that we find a reasonable way to at least say to the owners of those businesses, you can't do that. They've been forewarned. So when we talk about abandoned vehicles, we're talking about vehicles that needs to be worked on at this particular garage, but they continuously sit there
Yeah,
and obstruct traffic.
that'd be one instance, but I think the primary focus on this ordinance is residences where they have a bunch of property,
Just-
bunch of vehicles stored on their
abandoned.
property.
Yeah.
The towing businesses, they have some exceptions with zoning, with how many cars they can have and how many can be operable and that kind of thing. I'm not really sure what that is, but this ordinance is more directed towards the accumulation of abandoned cars in
That's
residential neighborhoods.
Well, I thought I'd just raise that just for the record,
Yes, sir.
because I'm gonna be talking to you guys. I've already talked to zoning about it.
Okay.
Um,
And we've addressed some, I know Councilman Davis is probably familiar with some of them that we've had to address, similar to what you just mentioned.
Because in effect, you've got cars that's just sitting there. They aren't being worked on, but they are just sitting there causing some real obstruction when you come off a main thoroughfare onto this side street. That's correct. So I know it's a different issue, and I just want to make sure, I understand the ordinance as it relates to abandoned vehicles, but what about, what about vehicles that supposedly aren't abandoned, but they are abandoned because they aren't being worked on, but rather being stored in the right of way?
Yeah. Well, I think we already have ordinances to address that. We'll just have to pull all the right people together and address it. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, sir.
Last night, typical example, I was out of meeting, and the complaint was a business on a particular street that sat right out intersection. colliding with a vehicle coming out of the parking lot of the business. And the business is coming off of the street into the thoroughfare. There's a danger there that they're gonna be swayed. So, it's just that, that is a serious challenge that I think and I think some of it involves somebody picking up the phone because of the seriousness of the one that I'm describing. It's one of those things you gotta see to believe it and understand it. And it's a question of whether we have folks where we can pick up the phone and report it as we see it, or, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chief.
If I can jump in and add, I think what Mr. Hatcher's explained, really the spirit of this ordinance is to address the abandoned vehicles in the yards. The points you all are making are real. Ms. Wilson pointed something out almost to exactly what you all are describing to us, recently. And it is a matter of collaborating with other entities in the city, whether it's our traffic unit, our region units, parking, or, operations in general, to put some signage. Oftentimes what we see in some of these neighborhoods, when you get off the main thoroughfare, is a road that's just blacktopped. So it doesn't have a center line, and it doesn't have lines on the side that indicate where the road, technically stops. So you also have people that park on the roadway a little bit, in the grass a little bit, but they also go towards the corner. So sometimes we can remedy that or mitigate some of the hazards by putting a no parking, from here to corner. So people can have a line of sight and see where they're turning. You obviously want to see the direction you're turning. Some of it may be zoning, what we're allowing that particular business to do, especially if it's an auto repair, how many cars they can have on the street, how long they can have it there, and that kind of stuff. But those are really case by case that we need to look at to see what our best course of action would be, trying to be fair, but also, never jeopardizing, public safety. So it just requires, communication, but I think that there's certainly divisions and units within the city and the police department that can effectively address that. Just need to know.
Sounds like we have that there's a pathway for that, and we just need to make sure we get the right people to the right place and get them identified and address it.
Yeah.
All right, Mr.
Certainly, if
Hatcher?
there's specific cases, certainly let me know that, so I'll be happy to initiate that coordination, certainly.
But if you would be in touch with Rachel Zoning, she and I have had several conversations about this particular situation. And I think Chief is on target. Perhaps a sign would probably help from one block to the other. I think we could probably mitigate that very simply if there is some real collaboration. But Rachel knows of that situation. Richland Street. She knows of that situation, and perhaps some collaborative notion from Two Notch Road, halfway the block, something similar to that. So thank you. I didn't want to diverse, but it's very important that we deal with this whole issue of abandoned cars. But it's also equally important that when you turn off of a main thoroughfare and you've got a stripe down the line, and of course both sides are tied up, it poses a real hazard and a danger. So yes, if you do that for us,
Yes, sir.
I appreciate it.
I'd like to share with you the instance from last night's meeting, and that would take a one-time shot, but I'll do it after the meeting.
Okay, yes, sir. Okay, back to the nuisance ordinance. We're, to address this in our ordinance so we can tow vehicles, I've outlined kind of where, with the help of legal, where we would need to address that in the ordinances. The first section would be 8-31, D7. We need to add a line in there to make it clear that violations of IPMC, which is International Private Maintenance Code 3028, are included. in the nuisance. We also need to add a line that gives us the ability to abate in section 8-36. And we also should consider revisions to section 839, which is liability for cost. 839 already addresses the abatement costs that the city incurs for other abatement activities. However, it does not, we would have to add something that says that the owner of the vehicle was responsible for all towing costs and storage fees if we decide to go that route. Lastly, the penalties for code enforcement violations. Currently, outside of the abatement context, code enforcement violations are prosecuted in municipal court, and they carry criminal penalties. Many of the ordinance violations enforced by code enforcement, including nuisance ordinances, are subject to the general criminal penalty in City Code 1 through 5, which is a fine of up to $500, 30 days in jail, or both. Although criminal penalties tend to have the most impact with gaining compliance from citizens, the collateral consequences of being found guilty of violating an ordinance can be quite serious for individuals. My recommendation is we should consider establishing a non-criminal penalty for an administrative fee for less severe violations and first offenses, such as overgrowth, litter, roll carts, that sort of thing. So they're not getting a criminal record for these types of violations.
So your recommendation would be that you, depending on the situation, probably warn them, and then you want to create a civil penalty schedule. Will that schedule then have, as people escalate up, 1 offense, 2 offense, 3 offense, the fine then grows?
Yes, sir,
Is
that's
that
how I
your
envision it.
intent?
Yes, and eventually it may end up being a criminal offense if it continues to
At a
escalate, but
certain
at least it's not, people don't have this criminal record on them forever for just not cutting the grass one
Right.
time.
So sorry.
Go ahead.
So you'll be coming back with that kind of a scale?
But yeah,
Chairman's mentioned, because
so the next,
part of the challenge has been the length of time it's taking to eliminate the offenses.
yes, sir.
So I think, Mr. Chairman, if we could kind of take a look at what you're really proposing, is that right?
Well, I
When you-
guess I was going to ask you all, this is, my last part would be in summary, I've proposed 2 major ordinance changes that I want to get some feedback from you all on and what direction you want us to go.
Yeah.
I'm not sure of the exact process, but I don't know if we need to go back to the committee or if we go straight to council once we make those revisions, but I think that's what we're all here to discuss and
Yeah,
work out.
I would recommend that it come back to the committee so we can
Yes.
review it, and then from there go to council. But I would recommend you come back with your changes, your recommended changes, the schedule for penalties, how you see each one of those, because I do think there are probably instances where everyone here will have some comments thinking, well, that's a bigger problem than you envisioned. We'd like that fine to be more severe, depending on the situation. I think that would probably be the best route, is to come back with a clear plan. All right, here it is. Here's what we see as a civil penalty. This is when it grows to a criminal penalty. This is how we see the fines flowing. This is how many offenses you're allowed before you take that next step to criminal charges.
Yes, sir.
Well-
So I guess the question is, the ordinance I proposed to you, is that something that we want to pursue and go ahead and start
Yeah,
making changes to city
Yeah,
ordinances?
I'm totally, I'm in agreement with it, and I think the sooner we get something to really sink our teeth into, the sooner I think we'll all get some relief.
Mr. Chairman.
For me, and the area I represent, it is daily. I could give you an example of last night. And they are things that impact the quality of life of folks. And I'd like us somehow to, as we move through this, to really consider how we separate results for owner occupied versus rental. I mean, it's all in one, but it seems like, where we have the absentee landlords, that's our biggest challenge. I know we'll get into that. But,
Sir.
but I think we really need to take another look at how we can, put some teeth in that. At the same time, that takes some, we'll end up taking some pressure off of staff, because we can't put staff in a car to go to Illinois, you know, to make something happen on a particular case.
Yes, sir.
So,
And that's what we're
I'm
hoping.
looking forward to that kind of.
Did you have,
Yes, sir.
you had something, Reverend McDowell?
Well, I think the way the chair has the protocol in terms of hearing the ordinance and routing this through the quote-unquote normal procedures, I think that's the ideal way to do that. Which would, of course, would that necessitate another meeting based on what you just said,
Yeah.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would be in favor of doing something similar to that. It just gives us a real clarifying statement in terms of how the ordinance fits itself in the fabric of the council's work and business.
I think, you know, is you come back to us with those two recommendations. One is the repeat offenders and the nuisance abatement. I think on the repeat offenders, I think it's very important that we talk a little bit more detail about the 22% of the 63% of the violations, to understand exactly where those are, and how we have that challenge, not only on rental, but unfortunately on also folks who own their home that are guilty as well, and how we're gonna move forward with that. I do think the more specific we can be, the more ability y'all have to try to enforce it and correct it. Even as y'all discussed earlier about the street parking and the sign, once the sign's up, then people don't have the excuse of ignorance. It's
Right.
there. I think we need to be very deliberate and detailed about how we're gonna make these changes, so people are very clear and understand. And then also how you wanna implement that, what type of grace period you're gonna give people to make sure that we notify them as well. Because there's gonna have to be a period of learning curve there for some folks, especially if we're changing the point system. We're going from criminal to civil, but then civil to criminal, and how that will work, so we can make sure that we get that out to everyone who is listed as a registered rental operator.
I want to make sure too, Mr. Chair, that we give you all some idea of the timeline, so we can, I think, pretty quickly come back, David, with these recommendations on the penalties and the fines and the escalation of it. But when we do start imposing non-criminal or civil penalties or fines, you know, we'd have to notice that those would be new fines that, you know, we haven't had on the books, so to speak. So that would require a notice period, Erica, I'm pretty sure. So how long in advance? 15 days. So just keep that in mind. We can try to turn this back around to you pretty soon. And if y'all want us to, I know our goal was to try to get this on council's agenda in the upcoming meetings.
So, from a staff perspective in a delivery, would it be fair if we met in November again, and then allowed you to have this and be able to be noticed on the council agenda, then be public notice, so that you could proceed with this in 2022? Is that?
Yeah,
your
that was
envision?
the goal. If we could, I really wanted you all to get your 2 readings in for the actual ordinance changes by the end of the calendar year. So, you know, factoring
Well, I'm
in another
available
committee
after
meeting.
November 2nd to meet, but until then, I'm a little busy.
Okay. I wonder why.
Yeah.
Anything going on, do you?
Let me say this. I think we have, as a city, arrived at this point as a result of the process that we're going through now, number one. And also, we all move around the city differently. Then for some reason, there are certain perceptions out there. I think as uniform as we can make these, the less perceptions will be out there. And that is that there are some parts of the city that we care or don't care about. And then you have to respond to that. And when folks say, well, I can take you in the car right now and take you to about 20 sites in 10 minutes and show you what I'm talking about. So I think the sooner we do this in a uniform manner, the schedule, I think, makes sense. The sooner we'll start to give some people relief. It's one thing for us to observe the types of violations that's requiring these kind of restrictions, but it's another for the people who live next door, 3 doors from these types of violations. And last night, I beat up, but that's okay. You have to say it goes with the job. They just want to know that we're going to fix the problem. Derelict cars in the yard growing up, everybody knows that that's a health violation, so forth and so on. And there shouldn't be an excuse for things like that. It impacts property values. So anything we can do to help you guys give us that roadmap with the necessary responses, whether it's fines or whatever, I think I'm willing to go with it, and I think we'll do good by the people who really and truly care about their neighborhoods. I mean, really. And all renters aren't bad. I would be the first person to say that.
Well, 500 out of 27 is a pretty low number, but it's still enough to
Right.
cause
Right.
issues in neighborhoods, or we would be sitting here today.
Right.
Very valuable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the bottom, excuse me, Mr. Chair. I think that's the bottom line. The bottom line is, I think procedurally, going through this process helps us to understand and helps the council to understand. I mean, the needs are already there. But I think it gives us a real opportunity to help those communities that really find themselves in real credulous situations for help. And they're asking for help. That's what they're asking for, help. And I think that's the bottom line for
Yeah.
each of us, who understands the issues in the community. I mean, abandoned cars in the community, man, you'd be surprised. And I'm sure you guys get these calls all the time about abandoned cars in a neighborhood, whether they're in front of the house or whether they're inside of on the property scattered about. Folk won't help, and I think that's the bottom line that Mr. Davis is talking about and what Cherry's talking about. I think we need to make sure that we're helping those folks. And it doesn't become an issue that metastasizes itself over and over again.
Last point. And I mean this, we really need to sharpen these so that they can be tools for you guys, for the staff, because I recall how difficult it had been over the years to get somebody to remedy some issues with a derelict building. For those who don't believe it, there was a time we were trying to chase them. Am I right, Aubrey? Down in Aiken, to go that far to get somebody to come back to Columbia and deal with their building that was sitting on a major corridor, leaning. Sometimes it was leaning left, sometimes it was leaning right.
I remember that building.
We try to keep it in the middle here.
And so that has happened. Anything to keep us from having to be faced with that moving forward, I think everybody would be willing to work with you.
Ms.
Matt, I was going to ask Madam Clerk if she, looking at the calendar, forthgoing what you thought we'd have a good time frame to try to have the next meeting so that we could stay in step with advertising 2 readings and really making this something that could move forward so that David and his team, along with, I mean, this is a tool for landlords too, to weave this into their leases so they have the ability to deal with unruly tenants and so forth. I mean, I wish more people treated their property like it was their property, their rental property like their property, but we are where we are today.
While Erica's looking at that timeline, Mr. Chair, Mr. Brennan couldn't be here today to listen in, but he called me on the way, and he's very supportive and interested in this topic as well. But he was asking about, there's certain platforms out there where the rental properties and I guess the individual owners or whatever are in the system, so to speak. So the points or the fines potentially are for public consumption. In other words, for people to see, who's not doing what they're supposed to do. I mean, if you're doing what you're supposed to do, I guess it wouldn't bother you what's shown, but for those that are not, and he said he'd had some community interest, and this probably came up before. I told him David was familiar with these different platforms, and it's something we've talked about, but obviously we need to do a little more research on the cost for that, and if we can move towards standing something like that up. I want it to be something that's actually beneficial to the staff, if you get into having to input all this stuff, but at the same time, it may also help y'all trigger, I guess, when certain things are due or when people are coming up on, having too many points being assessed. So aren't you familiar with some of those platforms, David?
Yeah.
He mentioned Gainesville, Florida, I think, has one that seems to work well, but I just threw that out there as we're discussing this for him.
I think that'd be great as you bring forth for our next meeting, David, maybe a recommendation as well behind the technology that will allow y'all to track, post, and allow us to have access on a more readily basis, because it does help.
I think it's good for the out-of-town parents who are trying to look for rental establishments for their children. They could look at the site and say, oh, maybe I don't want to rent there. Certainly a good resource.
Yes, sir. I mean, we probably could do this the first week in November.
That would be great, because you really need an ordinance to advertise at least by mid-November, the 3rd week in November.
Or, the other option is do it the last week of October. I mean, it's really, the pressure's on Mr. Hatcher to
Could be on
deliver.
legal as well to help me get these ordinances.
Oh,
on
they
and stuff.
got time all day long.
May I ask a question? This is
I don't know,
this
may
is
you?
This is STEAM group. So, Mr. Hatcher has proposed ordinance modifications. So am I understanding that these recommendations you're accepting, and what really the scope of what we're talking about now is?
We're supportive of it as
Yes,
it
sir.
is currently, but the detail is where it all lies. So once we can get the details and make sure that we're moving forward in the right direction, but yes, we want to recommend a change to the rest of the council.
The details concerning the fee structure and the fines, not the ordinance changes we're solid on.
I think we're all comfortable
I mean,
with
I'm
where we
comfortable
are. I
with that.
think it's
Yes,
really, and moving
Okay.
to a civil makes a lot of sense for the examples you've shown, and I imagine there's probably 50 more categories that you want to touch on, from roll cards to litter, to grass cutting, to dead trees, to who knows. Yeah. Conceptually, we're all there.
Yeah, I just tell you, the challenges of code enforcement has been a major part of my public life. And there are some people in neighborhoods, and then, you know, on the business side also, that are looking for us for some relief. And you do your best to assure them that we're not ignoring them. And I would suspect also that we do this and do it right, manpower may be a challenge. And we need to take a look at that as you move. And we end up with a final package on where we see, how we see these things during implementation and expected outcomes. In these cases, the outcomes will be obvious. Either something's happening or it's not happening.
I wanted to say this before I had to leave. I've got a group of employees waiting on me at Beltline, but honestly, I don't think this is gonna take David long. I mean, honestly, if I had known we were just gonna get hung up on the penalties, when we met about this, it didn't dawn on me that the penalties were incorporated in what you were already recommending. I really think we can turn this back around for you all for the sake of time and, November and getting through 2 readings and of course noticing it properly since fines will be implemented. If we could meet in another 2 weeks, if we can make that happen with you all's schedules.
So a week from now, we have a city council meeting, that won't work. So you're thinking the 26th of October? The last week?
Are you all available to be on the 28th of October?
On what?
The 28th of October?
As long as it's before noon.
I am.
October 28th?
I can do it before noon, I can't do it after lunch.
Okay. You good too?
I'm wide open. Let's
So,
go.
10 a.m.,
Let's go.
does that work? Does that work for you?
10
28th.
a.m.
It's a Thursday. Sam?
I'm
Mr.
good.
Davis, that good for you?
I'm
Ms.
good.
Wilson?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Hatcher?
Yes, sir.
TK, y'all good?
They're putting it on the house.
All right, I got it on mine. Sounds like we got a meeting date.
Okay, that'll work. Thank you all so much.
No, thank you.
Thank you all for your time.
David, I want to thank you all.
It wouldn't be a meeting if you didn't.
I want to thank you all. I know it's a voluminous job to do what you do. Our code enforcers,
What time?
I mean, they are.
At 10.
I want to commend them on some of the work that they do. They do it well. Chief, I want to thank you for your particular input into this code enforcement and the officers there. I think we could elongate what code enforcers do. I know some of them are overworked, probably underpaid, according to them anyway. But just a regular thing, I know it's a lot of this job. I know we got residential enforcers and commercial enforcers. And of course, they do what they're supposed to do. So I just want to say a word.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
We appreciate David and that team.
Thank
It's a lot of work. And he does have some staffing recommendations too, but I didn't bring those to you. I told him we would look at those going into the next budget cycle. And I think they need to be looked at with,
Well,
sure.
this is a good example of why it's important that we have discussions and y'all bring things. There's things that you see in the field that we don't see or we don't know about where we can make adjustments. And I think the more things that we can create opportunities through training, technology, adjusting ordinances so that y'all have some autonomy to do your jobs is gonna be important. And I think that's all the way across the city. And That's why I think this is important. I really appreciate you taking the initiative of looking at that, and because you're hearing from folks all the time, so you know what the issue is and what the hurdles are. And I think this is a step forward to, one, make your job easier and allow us to tackle a problem that has rippling effects in community. So thank you very much, David. Thank you, Chief, and staff for being here today. With that, we're gonna be adjourned.